Joseph Carter pushed open the heavy wooden door of Thompson's Grill, the slight creak echoing as he stepped inside. His worn boots clicked softly on the polished floor, in stark contrast to the elegance around him. The restaurant was everything he'd imagined, classy, filled with well-dressed patrons, and a scent of gourmet food lingering in the air. Joseph paused briefly, taking it all in, before making his way toward an empty table near the window. The hostess, a young woman with a tight bun and crisp uniform, barely acknowledged him as he approached. She was too busy staring at a party of wealthy customers laughing at the bar. Joseph, with his modest clothes and humble demeanor, wasn't the type of customer they were used to. "Excuse me, ma'am," Joseph said, his deep voice steady, though quiet. The hostess snapped her head toward him, her eyes scanning him up and down, lingering on his old army jacket. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone laced with irritation. "I'd like to get a table, please," Joseph replied politely, still standing tall, his military posture unwavering. "We're fully booked," she replied quickly, though Joseph could clearly see several empty tables. He furrowed his brow but remained calm. "Are you sure? I see quite a few tables available." The hostess narrowed her eyes, her lip curling slightly in disgust. "Those are reserved. You'd be more comfortable elsewhere, I'm sure." Joseph felt the sting of her words, but he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing it hurt him. "I'll wait for a table, then," he said quietly, moving to sit in a nearby chair, his resolve strong. The hostess clicked her tongue in frustration, turning on her heel and heading toward the back of the restaurant. Joseph sat in silence, watching the world outside the window. He was used to this. He had endured worse, much worse, but it never ceased to amaze him how easily people judged by the color of his skin or the simplicity of his clothes. It wasn't long before Rick Thompson, the restaurant owner, appeared. He strode across the floor with an air of superiority, his eyes locking onto Joseph like a predator spotting prey. Rick was a man who prided himself on his restaurant's exclusivity, and Joseph, in his eyes, was not part of that elite club. "Can I help you with something?" Rick asked, his voice dripping with disdain as he towered over Joseph. Joseph looked up at him calmly, meeting his gaze. "I'm waiting for a table. Your hostess said it might take a little while." Rick chuckled darkly, folding his arms across his chest. "You're wasting your time, old man. We don't serve people like you here." Joseph didn't flinch. "And what kind of people is that?" Rick smirked, glancing around to make sure others could hear the spectacle. "People who can't afford the menu, for starters. We're a high-class establishment, and judging by your appearance, you're better off down the street at the diner." A silence fell between them. The patrons nearby, sensing the tension, stole glances at the interaction, their whispers barely concealed. Joseph remained seated, his heart steady, his eyes unwavering. "You don't know anything about me," Joseph said softly, his voice steady and filled with quiet authority. Rick leaned closer, his face inches from Joseph's. "I know enough," he hissed. "Now get out of my restaurant before I have you thrown out." Joseph could feel the anger rising within him, but he controlled it, as he always had. He stood up slowly, towering over Rick for a moment, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the restaurant owner. He looked Rick in the eye, and for a brief moment, something flickered in Rick's expression, perhaps it was fear, or maybe recognition that Joseph was not a man to be trifled with. But the moment passed, and Joseph simply nodded, his face impassive. "I'll leave," he said calmly. "But remember this, you never know who you're really dealing with." With that, Joseph turned and walked out, his head held high. The murmurs of the onlookers grew louder, but he didn't care. He had been through too much in life to let a man like Rick Thompson bring him down. As Joseph stepped out into the crisp evening air, he took a deep breath. The night sky was clear, and the stars above twinkled as if mocking the darkness of the moment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, dialing the number he knew by heart. "Hey, David," he said when his son answered. "Something happened tonight." Back inside the restaurant, Rick watched Joseph leave, a satisfied smirk on his face. He strutted back to the bar, where a couple of regulars greeted him with knowing grins. "Who was that?" one of them asked, taking a sip of his bourbon. "Just some old bum who thought he could walk into my place like he belonged here," Rick sneered. "Can you believe the nerve?" The men laughed, and Rick joined them, his ego swelling with the approval. He poured himself a drink and raised his glass in a mock toast. "To keeping the riffraff where they belong," he said, clinking glasses with his patrons. But even as they laughed and drank, a seed of unease settled in Rick's mind. There was something about that old man, something about the way he carried himself, that didn't quite sit right. But Rick quickly dismissed the thought, drowning it in another gulp of whiskey. He had no idea how much his world was about to change. Meanwhile, Joseph sat at his modest kitchen table, the remnants of his quiet dinner before him. His son, Captain David Carter, sat across from him, his jaw clenched, his fists resting on the table. "And you just walked out?" David asked, his voice tight with anger. "What was I supposed to do?" Joseph replied calmly. "Make a scene. That's not how I raised you, and that's not how I live." David shook his head, the frustration clear in his eyes. "I can't believe that man had the audacity." "I can," Joseph interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "I've seen it my whole life, son. This isn't new." David took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "I'm not letting this go, Dad. This man, he thinks he can get away with treating you like that. Treating anyone like that. Not while I'm the captain of this city." Joseph leaned forward, his eyes softening. "David, I don't need you to fight this battle for me. I've fought enough in my life. But I know you're not just fighting for me. You're fighting for what's right." David nodded, though the tension remained. "I'll handle it the right way. But I promise you, this man will see justice." Joseph smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "I know, son. I trust you." As David stood up to leave, Joseph called out to him, his voice gentle but serious. "Remember, David. Justice isn't about vengeance. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." David paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. "I know, Dad. But sometimes, what's right is making sure people like him don't get to do this to anyone else." With that, David left, his mind already turning over the steps he would take. Joseph sat alone at the table for a moment longer, staring out the window into the night. In his office the next morning, David reviewed the incident. He had already sent one of his officers to discreetly investigate the restaurant. Reports had surfaced of similar behavior from Rick Thompson in the past, but nothing concrete had ever been documented. That was about to change. David's phone buzzed on his desk. He glanced at the screen. "Officer Rodriguez. Captain, I have what you asked for. Looks like this isn't the first time Thompson's had issues with customers of color." David felt a surge of anger, but he pushed it down. "Thanks, Rodriguez. Keep it quiet for now. I'll be handling this personally." As he hung up the phone, David's thoughts drifted back to his father. Joseph Carter was a man of dignity, a man who had taught him everything about honor and strength. And now, it was David's turn to honor his father, not with rage, but with justice. He stood from his desk, his uniform pressed and pristine. It was time to pay a visit to Thompson's Grill. David Carter sat at his desk, the weight of the badge on his chest never feeling as heavy as it did that morning. The sunlight streamed through the window of his office, casting long shadows across the room. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the edge of his desk, his mind replaying his father's calm voice from the night before. Something happened tonight. David knew his father didn't like to make a fuss. Joseph Carter had always been a man of quiet strength, letting his actions speak louder than words. But there was something in his tone that unsettled David. It wasn't anger, it was resignation, the kind that came from a lifetime of facing the same kind of prejudice. David's hand hovered over the phone on his desk. He had already spoken to Officer Rodriguez that morning, discreetly requesting some information on Thompson's Grill and its owner. Now, it was a waiting game, and David hated waiting. The door to his office creaked open, and Sergeant Michelle Evans poked her head in. "Captain, you've got a call on line 1. It's your father." David straightened in his chair, nodding at her before picking up the receiver. "Dad?" "David," Joseph's voice was as steady as ever, but David could sense the underlying tension. "I didn't want to make a big deal out of this, but I figured you'd want to know." David's grip on the phone tightened. "What happened?" Joseph sighed, the sound of his breath crackling through the line. "I went to Thompson's Grill last night. Thought I'd treat myself to a nice dinner. Didn't exactly go as planned." David's heart sank. He had heard rumors about that place. Thompson's Grill was known for catering to the wealthiest in town, and David had always suspected that Rick Thompson, the owner, held some backward views. But hearing it confirmed, hearing that his father had been the one disrespected, it ignited something inside him. "What did he do?" David asked, his voice low and controlled, though the anger simmered just beneath the surface. "Well," Joseph started, his tone almost casual, as if discussing the weather. "He made it clear that someone like me wasn't welcome there. Told me I didn't belong, even though there were plenty of open tables." David's knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone. "Did he touch you?" No, Joseph reassured him. "Nothing like that. Just words. But you know how words can sting." David's mind raced. He wanted to storm into that restaurant and make Rick Thompson regret ever opening his mouth. But that wasn't how Joseph had raised him. His father believed in justice, not revenge. "You know I can't let this slide, right?" David said, his voice tight. "I figured you'd say that," Joseph replied softly. "But David, remember, this isn't about me. It's about doing what's right." David leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I know, Dad. But that doesn't make it any easier." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Joseph spoke again. "I trust you to handle it." The line clicked dead, and David placed the receiver back in its cradle. For a moment, he sat in silence, staring at the framed photo on his desk, his father in his military uniform, standing tall and proud after returning from his last deployment. David had always looked up to him, not just for his service, but for the way he carried himself with dignity, even in the face of discrimination. David knew what he had to do. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Sergeant Evans, get Rodriguez in here." Moments later, Officer Rodriguez entered the office, a file in hand. He placed it on David's desk, his expression serious. "I've got the information you asked for, Captain," Rodriguez said. "Thompson's Grill has had a few complaints in the past, mostly about discriminatory practices, but nothing's ever stuck. The guy's careful, keeps things just under the radar." David opened the file, scanning through the reports. Nothing conclusive, just vague complaints and incidents that never went anywhere. "That changes now," David muttered under his breath. He looked up at Rodriguez. "We're going to pay Thompson's Grill a visit. I want everything done by the book. No mistakes." Rodriguez nodded. "Understood, Captain." As Rodriguez left the office, David leaned back in his chair, closing the file in front of him. This wasn't just about the law, this was personal. But he couldn't let that cloud his judgment. He had a responsibility, not just to his father, but to the people of this town. Later that afternoon, David walked into Thompson's Grill, the air inside thick with the scent of expensive food and wealth. He had been there once before, during a city function, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't here as a guest, he was here as the captain of the police force, and he was looking for answers. Rick Thompson spotted him immediately. The owner's confident swagger faltered slightly as he approached David, his face breaking into a forced smile. Captain Carter, Rick greeted, extending his hand. What brings you to my humble establishment? David didn't take his hand. He simply stared at Rick, his expression unreadable. I'm here on official business, Thompson. Rick blinked, his smile faltering. Official business? Is something wrong? David crossed his arms, his eyes scanning the restaurant. There've been some complaints about how you run things around here. Thought I'd stop by and see for myself. Rick laughed nervously, wiping his palms on his apron. Complaints? You must be mistaken. I run a respectable place here. We cater to the finest folks in town. Is that so? David asked, his voice calm but laced with steel. Because from what I've heard, you've been turning away certain people. People who don't fit your idea of fine. Rick's face reddened slightly, but he kept his smile plastered on. Now, Captain, I don't know what you've heard, but I assure you, I run a tight ship. Everyone's welcome here, so long as they can afford it. David took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Rick's. Is that why you refused to serve my father last night? Rick's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words. Your father. That's right, David said, his voice dangerously low. Joseph Carter. You told him he didn't belong here. Rick's face turned pale, the realization sinking in. He stammered, Captain, I didn't know. That he was my father. David cut in. No, you didn't. But that doesn't change what you did, does it? Rick's hands trembled as he tried to explain. It was a misunderstanding. Don't lie to me, David snapped, his patience wearing thin. You looked at him, and you judged him. You thought you could get away with it because he wasn't dressed like your usual customers. But let me tell you something, Thompson, my father's worth more than every person in this place combined. Rick swallowed hard, his bravado completely gone. Captain, I didn't mean any harm. It's just business. Business? David repeated, his voice rising. Discrimination isn't business, Thompson. It's illegal. And it's wrong. The other patrons had fallen silent, their eyes on the confrontation unfolding in the middle of the restaurant. Rick shifted nervously under their stares, wiping the sweat from his brow. I'll make it right, Rick pleaded. I'll apologize, personally. David shook his head. This isn't about an apology. This is about accountability. You think just because you own this place, you can treat people however you want. Not in my town. Rick's shoulders slumped in defeat, his once confident demeanor shattered. I understand, Captain. Please, just, give me a chance to fix this. David stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking. You'll be hearing from my office. Expect a full investigation into your business practices. With that, David turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Rick standing in the middle of his pristine dining room, sweat pouring down his face. The patrons resumed their conversations, though the atmosphere was noticeably more tense than before. Outside, David paused, the cool air filling his lungs. His heart was still racing, but he knew he had done the right thing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a start. He pulled out his phone and dialed his father's number. Joseph picked up after the first ring. Hey, Dad, David said, his voice softer now. I went by Thompson's Grill. There was a pause on the other end before Joseph responded. And we're going to make sure he doesn't get away with this. Joseph chuckled lightly. I knew you would. David smiled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. You taught me well. As David hung up the phone, he looked out over the town, the sun setting on the horizon. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, David felt like he was on the right path. David Carter sat in his office, staring at the report from Officer Rodriguez. The evidence against Rick Thompson wasn't just circumstantial anymore, it was a pattern. Complaints, incidents swept under the rug, and behavior that painted a clear picture of a man who believed himself untouchable. David had seen enough. It was time to confront Thompson, not just for his father, but for every person who had walked into that restaurant and left feeling humiliated. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was his father. "Dad?" David answered. "David, I've been thinking," Joseph said, his voice calm but thoughtful. "I don't want you to do anything drastic. This man isn't worth the trouble." David sighed. "Dad, it's not just about you. This guy's been doing this for years. You just happen to be the one who got under his skin enough to make him slip up. This needs to stop." "I understand," Joseph replied. "But just remember what I taught you. You're not just a man, you're a leader. Don't let your personal feelings cloud your judgment." David nodded, though his father couldn't see him. "I know, Dad. But you raised me to stand up for what's right. I can't let this go." There was a pause on the other end. "I trust you," Joseph said quietly. "Just be careful." Later that afternoon, David drove to Thompson's Grill. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the confrontation looming ahead was pressing down on him. When he parked, he saw the familiar sign above the restaurant's entrance, the elegant lettering that seemed to promise exclusivity. But David knew the truth now: this place was built on exclusion, not sophistication. Rick Thompson was waiting at the front when David entered. His face was pale, his usual smug confidence replaced with a nervous energy. He had clearly been dreading this meeting. "Captain Carter," Rick greeted, his voice tight. "I didn't expect you to come by so soon." David looked at him, eyes cold. "I told you I'd be back." Rick swallowed hard. "I've been thinking about what happened with your father. I want to make things right." David crossed his arms, his posture unyielding. "This isn't just about my father. You've been treating people like they don't belong here for years. I've got complaints dating back a decade, all with the same story: discrimination, exclusion, humiliation." Rick's eyes darted around the room, but there was no escape. I never meant for it to be like this." "Then how did it happen, Rick?" David's voice was sharp. "You've been doing this for so long, you think it's normal. But it's not. It's illegal, and it's wrong." Rick's shoulders slumped, his bravado collapsing under the weight of the accusations. "I didn't know who your father was. If I'd known..." David's temper flared. "It doesn't matter who he is. You shouldn't treat anyone that way. But you've built your entire business on making sure people like him don't feel welcome." Rick fell silent, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for an excuse. But David didn't give him the chance to speak. "There's going to be an investigation, Rick," David said firmly. "Your restaurant, your practices, everything. This isn't just going away." Rick's face turned a sickly shade of white. "You don't have to do that, Captain. I'll change. I'll make sure everyone is treated fairly from now on." David shook his head. "This isn't about what you'll do in the future. It's about what you've done." Later that evening, David sat in his father's living room, the familiar scent of old leather and wood filling the air. Joseph was in his favorite chair, looking at the fireplace but not really seeing it. David could tell something was on his mind. "What is it, Dad?" David asked, leaning forward. Joseph sighed. "I've been thinking a lot about Rick Thompson. About why he is the way he is." David frowned. "He's a racist. That's why." Joseph shook his head. "It's more than that. People don't just become this way out of nowhere. There's always something deeper." David's brows furrowed. "What are you saying?" Joseph hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I met Rick's mother once, years ago. Back when I first came to this town. She was a complicated woman, filled with anger. I never understood why. David's eyes widened in surprise. You knew her? Joseph nodded. Briefly. She didn't stay in town long after Rick was born. But I always got the sense that there was something she was hiding. David sat back, processing this new information. You think she's the reason Rick turned out this way? I think she's part of it, Joseph said quietly. But there's more. I don't think Rick ever knew who his father was. David's heart skipped a beat. Wait, what do you mean? Joseph sighed deeply. There were rumors back then. Rumors that Rick's father wasn't who everyone thought. David leaned in, his voice low. Who was he? Joseph didn't answer right away. He seemed to be weighing whether or not to reveal the truth. I think I might be his father, Joseph finally said, his voice barely a whisper. David froze, his mind reeling. What? Joseph's eyes were full of regret. I never knew for sure. But Rick's mother and I, we were together briefly. When I came back from the war, things were complicated. She left not long after. David stood up, pacing the room. Dad, are you telling me that Rick Thompson, the man who humiliated you, could be your son? Joseph nodded slowly. I don't know for certain, but it's possible. David ran a hand through his hair, trying to wrap his head around this revelation. This changes everything. Joseph looked up at him, his eyes heavy with sorrow. It doesn't change what he did. But it might explain why he's so angry. David sat back down, his mind racing. What are we going to do? Joseph shook his head. I don't know. But I think it's time we confronted the past. The next morning, David returned to Thompson's Grill, his thoughts still swirling from his father's revelation. Rick was behind the counter, looking even more disheveled than the day before. Rick, David said, his voice steady but firm. We need to talk. And this time, it's not just about the investigation. Rick looked up, his eyes weary. What is it now? David hesitated, unsure of how to begin. It's about your mother. And your father. Rick's face twisted in confusion. What about them? David took a deep breath. There's something you don't know. Something that could explain a lot. Rick leaned against the counter, crossing his arms defensively. What are you talking about? David met his gaze, unflinching. There's a possibility that your father wasn't who you think. It's possible that my father, Joseph Carter, could be your real father. Rick stared at him, his expression frozen in disbelief. What? That's impossible. It's not, David said quietly. My father and your mother were involved years ago, before you were born. He never knew for sure, but he always suspected. Rick's face drained of color. You're lying. I'm not, David replied firmly. And you know it. Deep down, you've always wondered why your mother never told you the truth. Rick stumbled back, his hand gripping the edge of the counter. This can't be real. It can't be. David watched as Rick struggled to process the news. The man who had spent his life building walls around himself, who had believed in his own superiority, was now faced with the possibility that everything he thought he knew was a lie. If it's true, Rick said slowly, his voice cracking, then I've been hating the wrong people my whole life. David stepped closer, his voice softening. You've been hating yourself, Rick. And it's time to let that go. Rick looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and despair. How do you expect me to believe this? David shrugged. You don't have to. But maybe it's time to find out the truth. That evening, Joseph sat across from Rick in his small, modest living room. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with years of unspoken words. Rick looked at the older man, his face etched with confusion and pain. Why didn't you tell me? Rick asked, his voice barely audible. Joseph sighed. I didn't know for sure. And by the time I started to suspect, your mother had left. I never had the chance to find out. Rick's hands trembled as he stared at the floor. I spent my whole life thinking I didn't have a father. Hating the man who wasn't there. Joseph's eyes softened. I understand that. But I'm here now. And we have to decide where to go from here. Rick looked up, tears brimming in his eyes. I don't know how to fix this. Joseph leaned forward, his voice gentle. You start by letting go of the hate, Rick. You've been holding on to it for too long. It's time to move on. Rick nodded, his body sagging as the weight of his past fell away. For the first time, he saw Joseph not as an enemy, but as a man who had been caught in the same tangled web of life. I'm sorry, Rick whispered, his voice breaking. For everything. Joseph reached out, placing a hand on Rick's shoulder. We can't change the past, but we can decide what to do with the future. As the night deepened, the two men sat together, the silence between them no longer filled with resentment, but with the quiet possibility of reconciliation. David sat back, processing this new information. You think she's the reason Rick turned out this way? I think she's part of it, Joseph said quietly. But there's more. I don't think Rick ever knew who his father was. David's heart skipped a beat. Wait, what do you mean? Joseph sighed deeply. There were rumors back then. Rumors that Rick's father wasn't who everyone thought. David leaned in, his voice low. Who was he? Joseph didn't answer right away. He seemed to be weighing whether or not to reveal the truth. I think I might be his father, Joseph finally said, his voice barely a whisper. David froze, his mind reeling. What? Joseph's eyes were full of regret. I never knew for sure. But Rick's mother and I, we were together briefly. When I came back from the war, things were complicated. She left not long after. David stood up, pacing the room. Dad, are you telling me that Rick Thompson, the man who humiliated you, could be your son? Joseph nodded slowly. I don't know for certain, but it's possible. David ran a hand through his hair, trying to wrap his head around this revelation. This changes everything. Joseph looked up at him, his eyes heavy with sorrow. It doesn't change what he did. But it might explain why he's so angry. David sat back down, his mind racing. What are we going to do? Joseph shook his head. I don't know. But I think it's time we confronted the past. The next morning, David returned to Thompson's Grill, his thoughts still swirling from his father's revelation. Rick was behind the counter, looking even more disheveled than the day before. Rick, David said, his voice steady but firm. We need to talk. And this time, it's not just about the investigation. Rick looked up, his eyes weary. What is it now? David hesitated, unsure of how to begin. It's about your mother. And your father. Rick's face twisted in confusion. What about them? David took a deep breath. There's something you don't know. Something that could explain a lot. Rick leaned against the counter, crossing his arms defensively. What are you talking about? David met his gaze, unflinching. There's a possibility that your father wasn't who you think. It's possible that my father, Joseph Carter, could be your real father. Rick stared at him, his expression frozen in disbelief. What? That's impossible. It's not, David said quietly. My father and your mother were involved years ago, before you were born. He never knew for sure, but he always suspected. Rick's face drained of color. You're lying. I'm not, David replied firmly. And you know it. Deep down, you've always wondered why your mother never told you the truth. Rick stumbled back, his hand gripping the edge of the counter. This can't be real. It can't be. David watched as Rick struggled to process the news. The man who had spent his life building walls around himself, who had believed in his own superiority, was now faced with the possibility that everything he thought he knew was a lie. "If it's true," Rick said slowly, his voice cracking, "then I've been hating the wrong people my whole life." David stepped closer, his voice softening. "You've been hating yourself, Rick. And it's time to let that go." Rick looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and despair. "How do you expect me to believe this?" David shrugged. "You don't have to. But maybe it's time to find out the truth." That evening, Joseph sat across from Rick in his small, modest living room. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with years of unspoken words. Rick looked at the older man, his face etched with confusion and pain. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rick asked, his voice barely audible. Joseph sighed. "I didn't know for sure. And by the time I started to suspect, your mother had left. I never had the chance to find out." Rick's hands trembled as he stared at the floor. "I spent my whole life thinking I didn't have a father. Hating the man who wasn't there." Joseph's eyes softened. "I understand that. But I'm here now. And we have to decide where to go from here." Rick looked up, tears brimming in his eyes. "I don't know how to fix this." Joseph leaned forward, his voice gentle. "You start by letting go of the hate, Rick. You've been holding on to it for too long. It's time to move on." Rick nodded, his body sagging as the weight of his past fell away. For the first time, he saw Joseph not as an enemy, but as a man who had been caught in the same tangled web of life. "I'm sorry," Rick whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything." Joseph reached out, placing a hand on Rick's shoulder. "We can't change the past, but we can decide what to do with the future." As the night deepened, the two men sat together, the silence between them no longer filled with resentment, but with the quiet possibility of reconciliation. David Carter walked into the restaurant with an air of authority, his jaw clenched as he prepared for what he knew would be a volatile confrontation. Thompson's grill looked just as it had before, polished, exclusive, and cold. The clientele of the restaurant continued to chatter softly, their glasses clinking in a rhythm of privilege. None of them had any idea what was about to unfold. Rick Thompson stood behind the counter, his back to the door. He was checking the day's receipts, muttering to himself. His body language was tense, he knew the storm that was brewing. David could see it in the rigidness of Rick's posture, the way his fingers twitched with nervous energy. When Rick finally turned around and saw David standing there, his face went pale. "Captain," Rick stammered, his usual bravado deflating. I wasn't expecting you." David didn't waste any time. "We need to talk, Rick. This can't wait any longer." Rick swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the patrons around them. He tried to force a smile, the kind he reserved for customers who expected service with a smile, but it faltered. "Sure, let's go to my office," Rick suggested, gesturing toward the back of the restaurant. "No," David said, his voice firm. "We're doing this here." Rick's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he seemed paralyzed. He glanced around the room, but David didn't care about the audience. The truth needed to come out, and hiding it away in a back room wasn't going to change anything. David took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Rick could hear. "It's time we talk about my father." Rick flinched as though the words had struck him physically. His hands tightened into fists at his sides, and his face hardened, the fear momentarily replaced by defensiveness. "I already told you I'm sorry for what happened," Rick said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I didn't know." "You didn't know he was my father," David interrupted, his voice growing colder. "But you knew what you were doing. You've been doing it to people like him for years. And now, I've found out why." Rick blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" David's eyes narrowed, his anger barely contained. "You spent your whole life hating people like my father, but you never knew that the man you've been hating all these years might be your own father. Rick's face went white, his mouth falling open in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" His voice cracked, his eyes darting around the restaurant as if looking for an escape. David didn't flinch. "You heard me. Joseph Carter might be your father." Rick stumbled back a step, the weight of the words crashing down on him. He looked like he might collapse, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of a nearby table to steady himself. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in denial. "That's impossible." David leaned in, his voice harsh but steady. "It's not. My father and your mother were together before you were born." He didn't know for sure, but the timing fits. "She never told him, and you've spent your life hating a man who might be your blood." Rick's breathing grew shallow, and for a moment, David thought he might pass out. The other patrons had begun to take notice of the scene unfolding, their conversations growing quieter as they watched the exchange with curious eyes. "You're lying," Rick hissed, his voice trembling with desperation. "This can't be true." David crossed his arms, his eyes locked on Rick. "You know it's true. Deep down, you've always known something wasn't right. Your mother never told you the full story, did she?" Rick shook his head violently, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No, she wouldn't have kept that from me." David let out a bitter laugh. "You sure about that? Because everything she did points to her hiding the truth. And now, you're going to have to face it." Rick stood there, frozen, his mind reeling. The arrogance and smugness he had carried for years were gone, replaced by a man who was lost in a sea of confusion and anger. "What do you want from me?" Rick finally asked, his voice small and broken. David's gaze softened slightly, but his resolve remained. "I want you to face what you've done. You've spent your whole life hurting people because of your own insecurities. You built your empire on exclusion and hatred. It's time for that to end." Rick slumped into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands. "I don't know how to fix this." David took a step back, his voice steady but not unkind. "You start by taking responsibility. You've hurt a lot of people, Rick. Including the man who might be your own father. It's time you make it right." Rick lifted his head, tears brimming in his eyes. For the first time, David saw the cracks in Rick's armor, the vulnerability, the fear, and the shame that had been buried beneath years of bitterness. "I don't know if I can," Rick whispered, his voice shaking. "You can," David replied firmly. "But it's up to you." Later that evening, Joseph Carter sat in his living room, staring at the fire burning in the hearth. The day had been long, and the conversation with Rick weighed heavily on his mind. He had never expected this moment to come, to sit across from a man who might be his son, a man who had spent years hating him without even knowing why. There was a knock at the door, and Joseph stood slowly, his knees aching from years of hard living. When he opened the door, he wasn't surprised to see Rick standing there, his face pale and drawn. He looked like a man who had just seen his entire world collapse. "Can I come in?" Rick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Joseph stepped aside, allowing Rick to enter. The two men stood there for a moment, the weight of the unspoken words between them hanging heavy in the air. "I don't know where to start," Rick admitted, his voice shaking. "I don't know how to undo what I've done." Joseph gestured to the couch, and the two men sat down, facing each other. The fire crackled softly in the background, casting a warm glow over the room. "You don't have to undo it all at once," Joseph said quietly. "But you do need to start somewhere." Rick ran a hand through his hair, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I spent my whole life angry at the world, angry at myself. I didn't even know why half the time. But now I'm starting to understand." Joseph nodded slowly. "Anger can blind you, Rick. It makes you see enemies where there are none." Rick looked down at his hands, his voice barely a whisper. "I hurt so many people." Joseph leaned forward, his gaze soft but firm. You can make things right. But it's going to take time. And you're going to have to work for it. Rick looked up, meeting Joseph's eyes. How do I start? You start by letting go of the hate, Joseph said gently. You've been holding on to it for too long. It's time to let it go. Rick's face crumpled, and for the first time in years, he let the tears fall. Joseph sat beside him in silence, offering no judgment, only understanding. I'm sorry, Rick whispered, his voice breaking. Joseph placed a hand on Rick's shoulder, his voice soft but steady. I forgive you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Rick had never imagined that forgiveness could feel like this, like the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. Thank you, Rick whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Joseph nodded, his eyes kind. It's time to move forward, Rick. The past is the past. Now we have to decide what to do with the future. As the night deepened, the two men sat together, the silence between them no longer filled with tension or resentment. There was still much to be done, many wounds that needed healing, but for the first time, there was hope. The path ahead would not be easy, but it was a path they could walk together. Outside, the stars glittered in the night sky, and the world felt just a little bit lighter. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the Carter home, casting a warm glow on the modest living room. Joseph Carter sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, lost in thought. The events of the last few days weighed heavily on him, Rick Thompson's confession, the revelation of their potential bloodline, and the storm of emotions that had followed. A knock at the door pulled Joseph from his reverie. He stood slowly, his knees aching from years of military service. When he opened the door, David stood there, his expression serious but calm. Dad, can I come in? David asked. Joseph stepped aside, gesturing for his son to enter. David walked in, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold, a gesture of respect he'd always shown his father. He took a seat across from Joseph at the table. I wanted to check in on you, David said. I know the last few days haven't been easy. Joseph nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. They've been complicated, that's for sure. But I've had time to think. David leaned forward, concern etched on his face. What are you thinking, Dad? Joseph placed the cup down, his eyes meeting David's. I've thought about Rick. About everything that's happened. And I've come to a decision. David straightened in his chair, bracing himself for whatever his father was about to say. Joseph paused, choosing his words carefully. I want to offer Rick a chance at reconciliation. David's eyes widened in disbelief. Reconciliation? After everything he's done, after the way he treated you, and not just you, but so many others? Joseph raised a hand to calm his son. I know it's hard to understand, David. But I've been through too much in my life to carry the weight of anger. Rick is lost, he's been living with hate and bitterness. I don't know if he's my son, but what I do know is that he needs to find his way back. David shook his head, his frustration rising. You're talking about forgiveness, Dad. And I get it, I really do. But what he did was more than just a mistake, it's a pattern. A lifetime of causing pain. And you want to just let it go? Joseph sighed. I'm not saying there won't be consequences. He's going to have to face justice for what he's done. But holding on to this anger won't bring peace, not to me, not to him, and not to this town. David stood up, pacing the room, trying to wrap his mind around what his father was saying. So, what do you want me to do? Drop the investigation? Joseph shook his head. No. I want you to do your job, son. Do it right. Investigate, hold him accountable, but offer him a path to redemption. David stopped pacing, looking down at his father. You really believe he deserves that? Joseph met his son's gaze with steady eyes. Everyone deserves a chance to change, David. It's what separates us from the hate we fight against. David sat back down, his shoulders slumping slightly. I don't know if I'm as forgiving as you, Dad. Joseph smiled gently. You'll find your way, son. You always do. Later that afternoon, David stood outside Thompson's Grill. The restaurant was closed for the day, an investigation had been launched following multiple complaints, and the public was well aware of the scandal that had erupted. David walked up to the door and knocked. After a moment, Rick Thompson opened the door. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. The man who had once carried himself with arrogant confidence now looked broken. Captain, Rick greeted him weakly. I didn't expect you. David nodded, stepping inside as Rick led him to a table. They sat down, and for a moment, the silence between them was thick with tension. I'm not here to sugarcoat anything, Rick, David began, his tone firm. There's an ongoing investigation, and I've got the authority to see that justice is done. You're going to have to answer for what you've done, not just to my father, but to everyone you've hurt. Rick swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly on the table. I know. I deserve it. David leaned in, his voice softening slightly. But my father, he's offering you something I don't think you've ever been given before. A chance to make things right. Rick blinked, confusion flickering across his face. What do you mean? He wants to meet with you, David explained. He wants to talk, to give you a chance to explain yourself. Not just to him, but to yourself. Rick stared at David, his face crumpling with disbelief. After everything I've done, he wants to talk. David nodded. My father believes in redemption, Rick. He thinks you can change. Rick's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve that. Maybe you don't, David said bluntly. But he's offering it anyway. What you do with that chance is up to you. Rick wiped at his eyes, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to face him. How do I even start to make up for everything I've done? David stood up, looking down at Rick. You start by owning up to it. No more excuses, no more hiding. Be the man my father thinks you can be. Rick nodded, his face still streaked with tears. I'll meet him. I'll do whatever it takes. The sun was setting when Rick arrived at Joseph's house. His steps were slow and hesitant as he approached the front door. The weight of years of resentment and guilt hung heavily on his shoulders, but he knew he couldn't run from it any longer. Joseph opened the door before Rick could knock, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He smiled softly, though his eyes were filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. Come on in, Rick, Joseph said, stepping aside to let him enter. Rick hesitated for a moment before stepping into the warm, modest home. The atmosphere was welcoming, and for the first time in a long while, Rick felt a strange sense of calm. They sat down across from each other in the living room, the crackle of the fireplace filling the silence. I don't know where to begin, Rick said, his voice shaky. Joseph nodded. Start with the truth. Rick took a deep breath, looking down at his hands. I've spent my whole life angry. I didn't know why at first. My mother, she never talked about my father. I grew up thinking he didn't want me, that I wasn't good enough. And I guess I started hating anyone who reminded me of that. I turned it into hate for people who didn't look like me, who didn't fit into the world I tried to build. Joseph listened quietly, his expression thoughtful but not judgmental. And what about now? Do you still believe that world you built was right? Rick shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes again. No. I don't. But I don't know how to undo what I've done. Joseph leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. The first step is acknowledging the harm you've caused. You've hurt a lot of people, Rick. You can't change the past, but you can decide what kind of man you want to be from now on. Rick wiped at his eyes, his voice cracking. I want to change. I don't want to be that man anymore. Joseph smiled, a small but genuine smile. Then start with that. Start by being honest, by making amends where you can. It won't be easy, but it's the only way forward. Rick nodded, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of years had finally been lifted. Thank you, Joseph. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but, thank you. Joseph reached out, placing a hand on Rick's shoulder. It's not about deserving it. It's about doing what's right, for both of us. They sat in silence for a while longer, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the room. For the first time, the silence wasn't filled with tension or resentment. It was filled with the quiet possibility of healing. The next morning, Rick stood outside Thompson's Grill. The restaurant was still closed, the investigation ongoing, but this time, he wasn't there as the arrogant owner. He was there as a man ready to face the consequences of his actions. David arrived a few minutes later, standing beside Rick in silence for a moment before speaking. Are you ready? David asked. Rick nodded, his face pale but determined. I am. David gave him a small, approving nod. Good. Let's do this. Together, they walked into the restaurant, ready to face the truth and whatever came next. There was no going back, but for the first time, Rick was ready to move forward, ready to become the man Joseph believed he could be. As they stepped into the building, Rick felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He had a long way to go, but with Joseph's forgiveness and David's sense of justice guiding him, he knew he was on the right path. The story of hatred and division had finally given way to a new chapter, one of redemption, reconciliation, and hope.